And now, without further ado, let's begin.
I'm 16, live in Alabama, and as the typical Southerner stereotype, I love hunting. It's my passion, and I can't get enough of it. Something about the woods and the thrill of the hunt just satisfies me. Nothing out of the ordinary has happened on any of my other trips, besides the one that I will describe. But before we get into my encounter, I think I should give a little background information. According to my mom, my dad would take me out with him when he went hunting on our private property when I was just a little guy. And then one day, he suddenly just stopped hunting altogether. Like, completely done with it. He took down all the stuffed deer heads and skulls, etc., and tried to sell his guns. Luckily, my mom was able to talk him into letting me have one of them, a bolt-action rifle with a thermal scope, when I was old enough to be responsible with it. I didn't know why my dad did what he did, but I think I found out during the events of my story. My first hunt alone was when I was around 13 years old. I had previously gone with my best friend and his dad, but this time I wanted to try it by myself. My dad's old camouflaged tree house was still intact deep in the woods, and I used that until I was older. Nowadays, it has pretty much fallen out of the tree due to my lack of actually trying to take care of it. So, I decided to make my own way of hunting. I had just turned 15 when I put my idea into action. I'd been playing a lot of Call of Duty lately, I still do to this day, and was obsessed with the idea of ghillie suits. For those that don't know what those are, it is basically a tactical form of camouflage used by military operators, mostly snipers, that are meant to disguise oneself completely by attaching various parts of the surrounding environment, such as leaves, grass, or whatever was around, to all areas of the body. It comes into play mostly when the user is laying down or hiding in a bush or other small foliage. If you want to see one, just Google it. Anyhow, on to our main story. I had managed to throw together a pretty good ghillie suit out of my dad's old hunting clothes and a bunch of leaves that I found outside. It was fall at the time, so dead leaves were my best bet of concealment. In the present, I've earned a nickname at school for my unique form of hunting, the bush boy. I was feeling so excited, imagining myself aiming my rifle at a large buck and bagging something great that day. My girlfriend, who we'll call MJ for privacy reasons, always liked seeing what I brought back from the woods, even though she wasn't too into the idea of killing animals for sport. Deciding that evening or night would be the best environment to test my ghillie suit, I left my house at around 7:30 p.m. on a Saturday, a decision I now regret. I had brought my usual gear, my dad's old rifle with the thermal scope, the Glock G40 10mm that I had saved up for myself and my dad bought for me, since I wasn't of legal age to purchase it on my own. For those wondering why I have that, it's for in case I unfortunately don't get the kill in one shot with my rifle, and I have to put the poor animal out of its misery at close range, even if my prize ends up having a bullet hole through its head. I also brought my hunting knife, a shovel, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. Now, I'm a bit of a crazy guy and not afraid to get a little blood on my hands. I usually slice off only the heads of my kills and skin them, collect the skulls when I get home. One of my favorite movie franchises is Predator, whose antagonists are aliens that hunt dangerous species, including humans, and take their schools as trophies. I'm a dork and love copying them. Except I prefer to shoot deer and not Arnold Schwarzenegger. But I'm not a monster, and I try to show some respect by burying the remains of my kills, hence the shovel. As I was walking into the woods to find a good spot to lay down, I FaceTimed MJ, like I usually do before I really get into the zone. She picked up immediately, and we had an interesting conversation about my new appearance. I fondly remember her repeating the phrase, "You look ridiculous, but hot at the same time." When I finally found a suitable spot to lay down, We hung up after many "I love you," and I put my shovel and first aid kit against a nearby tree and marked the tree with a neon pink ribbon so I wouldn't lose them if I got something and went over to it to do my work. Then I laid down on my stomach, rifle ready, and waited, and waited, and waited. By the time I looked at my watch, 3.5 hours had passed. I usually go home after about 3 hours without anything showing up, but today I was determined to catch something with my beloved new ghillie suit. About 15 minutes later, luck found me. A huge buck came wandering out of the brush around 20 yards away. It was unnaturally tall, I'd guess standing at around 5 feet, and looked quite disheveled, like it had not eaten in a long time. The weirdest part about it was its eyes. They were blank-looking and milky white. It sent a small shiver down my spine. However, I brushed off this odd phenomenon by assuming that it was blind. My eyes were only on the prize, the giant rack of antlers that sucker had on its head. But the fact that this deer may be blind made it more likely that it used its ears to get around and avoid predators, and that any movement I made, even moving my foot in the leaves, would be enough to make it run off in panic. Recognizing this, I tried to be as still as possible while adjusting my position to get my crosshairs right on the heart. The buck was standing still as a statue, making it slightly easier to aim exactly where I knew the heart would be. What was strange, however, was that my thermal scope appeared not to see it. The only way that was possible was if the deer wasn't giving off any body heat, which was physically impossible. Looking through the scope, it was like the buck was simply part of the trees and bushes around it. I could only see its outline because it was standing so still. The forest had also fallen unnervingly quiet. Utter silence, making a mental note to see if there was anything wrong with my scope. When I got home, I lined up my shot and pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the deer dead in the spot I had been aiming for, and I saw a burst of scarlet come from it as the muzzle flash from my gun briefly lit up the almost pitch-black environment. I listened for the thud of the deer as it fell to the ground, screaming in pain, before I stood up and let out a cry of triumph. Even though my ghillie suit hadn't really been of any use since the buck was seemingly blind, I was still happy that I had managed to bag something this big. I turned on my flashlight and walked over to the tree where I left my other gear, where I now laid my rifle before taking out my hunting knife and twirling it around in my hand. Illuminating the spot where the deer had fallen, I noticed that it was still moving. Sighing and feeling disappointed that this trophy wouldn't be entirely intact when I finally claimed it, I pulled out my handgun and turned the safety off before walking towards the still struggling deer, intending to end its suffering with a shot to the head. However, I stopped in my tracks as the bleeding animal suddenly went quiet, and it stood up, on 2 legs, like a person. I'm exactly 6 feet in height, and I'm one of the taller dudes at school, but this thing towered over me, standing at least 9 feet tall. And mind you, there was still about a 15 yards distance between me and the deer. Now looking closer, I observed that instead of hooves on its front legs or hands, it had human-like hands that all ended in claws, stained with what appeared to be blood. I simply stood there looking up at this thing, dumbfounded and terrified at the abomination that stood before me. I couldn't move. I was so scared. I thought I was dreaming and squeezed my eyes shut to try and make myself up. But then, the creature opened its mouth, revealing a set of huge and razor-sharp teeth, and screeched. It was the most horrible noise I have ever heard in my entire life. It sounded like a combination of a younger woman screaming at the top of her lungs and a mountain lion's roar. I was still stuck where I stood, eyes wide. Suddenly, the thing fell back to all fours and started scuttling towards me like a spider, its body and head low to the ground. It was then that I was finally able to turn tail and sprint at top speed back towards the familiar direction of my house, not caring that I was leaving my dad's precious rifle and other items behind. I'm pretty sure that if I ran that fast again, I could outrun Usain Bolt in his prime. But all the while, I could hear the monster right behind me, still screeching its horrible screech. At one point, I felt a sharp pain in my calf, but it didn't slow me down one bit. Sighing and feeling disappointed that this trophy wouldn't be entirely intact when I finally claimed it, I pulled out my handgun and turned the safety off before walking towards the still struggling deer, intending to end its suffering with a shot to the head. However, I stopped in my tracks as the bleeding animal suddenly went quiet and it stood up, on two legs, like a person. I'm exactly 6 feet in height, and I'm one of the taller dudes at school, but this thing towered over me, standing at least 9 feet tall. And mind you, there was still about a 15 yards distance between me and the deer. Now looking closer, I observed that instead of hooves on its front legs or hands, it had human-like hands that all ended in claws, stained with what appeared to be blood. I simply stood there looking up at this thing, dumbfounded and terrified at the abomination that stood before me. I couldn't move. I was so scared. I thought I was dreaming and squeezed my eyes shut to try and make myself up. But then, the creature opened its mouth, revealing a set of huge and razor-sharp teeth, and screeched. It was the most horrible noise I have ever heard in my entire life. It sounded like a combination of a younger woman screaming at the top of her lungs and a mountain lion's roar. I was still stuck where I stood, eyes wide. Suddenly, the thing fell back to all fours and started scuttling towards me like a spider, its body and head low to the ground. It was then that I was finally able to turn tail and sprint at top speed back towards the familiar direction of my house, not caring that I was leaving my dad's precious rifle and other items behind. I'm pretty sure that if I ran that fast again, I could outrun Usain Bolt in his prime. But all the while, I could hear the monster right behind me, still screeching its horrible screech. At one point, I felt a sharp pain in my calf, but it didn't slow me down one bit. Thankfully, I spied the lights of my house through the trees. A small sense of relief flooding me, I flew across the empty backyard, up the porch, into the house, and slammed the door so hard that the entire house shook. I rushed over to the window and ripped the curtains away, but there was nothing. The lights of the back porch illuminated an empty backyard. The deer was gone, vanished. Still not convinced that I was safe, I hastily zoomed all over the house, locking every door and window and triple-checking that they were indeed locked after I finished. Once again, I found myself at the back door. But suddenly, I heard a voice behind me. "You saw it, didn't you, son?" It was my dad. He was standing stock still on the stairs in his pajamas, staring right at me, without blinking. Adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, and I was still on high alert. After thinking for a moment, I gave him an answer. No, what? I just got startled by a grizzly. Yeah, a grizzly snuck up on me. I think I'm going to go to bed, though. I slowly walked up the stairs to go to my room, my dad still standing there, unmoving and silent, watching me go up the stairs until we couldn't see each other anymore. As I arrived in my room, a pleasant surprise awaited me. My girlfriend, MJ, was sitting on my bed, smiling at me. She started to ask if I had gotten anything, before a look of concern fell over her face. I saw myself in a mirror and couldn't blame her. My ghillie suit was shredded, and I was as white as a sheet. By then, the adrenaline rush had started to wear off, and I started shaking and trembling violently. MJ quickly got up and helped me lay down on my bed. I distinctly remember her saying, "Shh," and playing with my hair, as I rested my head in her lap and just laid there, gasping for air. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember was seeing my alarm clock reading 1 p.m. MJ had fallen asleep, her back against the head of my bed and her fingers still touching me own head. I gently sat up, and she woke up as well. "Sean, what's wrong? What happened last night?" She took my hands and looked straight into my face when she asked. I didn't know what to say, what I was supposed to say. Eventually, I ended up whispering, "Monster." She didn't know what that meant, and so I slowly told her the same story that I'm telling you now, about what happened in those woods, about the not deer. Thinking back on this, I remembered something. My ghillie suit. It had worked. The monster clearly had not been blind, but had not seen me when I was laying on the ground. If I had not been wearing it, I probably would have died. I'm sure that you're thinking that this is where it ends, but I'm afraid that I had one more experience with the thing that chased me that night. Quite unfortunately, it happened the next evening. But this time, I wasn't in the woods or alone. I was home alone with MJ. It was around 9 p.m., and my parents were out, likely at a party. MJ had stayed at my house for the day because she was still worried about me. We had just eaten dinner and were in my room, having our snuggle time. My calf was bandaged up because it turned out that the monster had managed to land a hit on me during our high-speed chase back to my house. It was a single scratch mark, but thankfully had not gone very deep. MJ and I turned out the lights, and we went to bed, the sound of crickets and such lulling us to sleep. Around 15 minutes later, everything suddenly went quiet, like someone had pressed the mute button on the Earth's TV remote. The deathly silence that I now associate with the not deer. MJ was asleep with her head on my chest, but I was very much awake now. She must have woken up too to the sound of my heart skyrocketing above 2,000 decibels, and she blinked up sleepily at me. Then we heard a soft tap, tap, tap at my room's window that ironically happened to face the woods. We were both frozen in fear, listening for another sound. And it came again, tap, tap, tap. MJ looked up at me again and whispered that she was scared. So, I told her to stay put as I got out of the bed. I'd left my unloaded Glock within arm's reach from the bed earlier in the morning, so I grabbed it, slipped the magazine in, and flipped off the safety. I crept towards the obscured window, dreading what I would find. Almost standing right in front it, I peeked out of the crack between the curtains and saw what appeared to be an antler right outside the window. I quickly turned around and slammed my back against the window, realizing what was outside. MJ was looking at me with fear in her eyes, and all I could do was stare back at her. Then there was another tap, tap, tap at the window behind me before I heard a voice call my name from outside. It was MJ's voice. "Sean, come outside, Sean." It sounded exactly like her, but nothing like her at the same time. It was flat and emotionless. MJ was silently crying now and panic whispering that it was not her speaking. Then the voice came again. "It's me, Sean. Come give me a kiss, Sean." By now, I had regained my confidence and decided that I had to do something to protect myself and my girlfriend before the creature outside got into the house. So, I turned around, raised my gun, and emptied the entire magazine through the window. It shattered, and I heard that god-awful screech again as I glimpsed the not deer scrambled back into the woods and out of sight. I had to have hit it. I was 100% sure. But I was not going to take any chances, remembering that this thing had pretty much shrugged off a rifle round the previous night. So, I tossed the gun aside, grabbed MJ's arm, and went to hide in the attic. The only thing I remember afterward is my parents getting home around 2 in the morning and finding us hiding there. My mom was quite reasonably upset that I had shot my window out, but my dad was not. He seemed to know what had happened, and went off to go order someone to replace the now destroyed window. MJ went home, and I couldn't blame her. It's been a year since this happened. MJ and I are still happily together, but we do not talk about what happened those 2 nights except when we are alone. I still go hunting with an improved ghillie suit, and I managed to recover the gear I had left in the woods during that fateful encounter. However, I always make sure that the deer I'm about to shoot is normal-sized, has normal eyes, and gives off body heat. What I believe nearly killed me those 2 nights a year ago was a Wendigo, an evil spirit doomed to walk the earth forever, fueled by rage, ever thirsty for blood, picking off those unfortunate enough to be fooled by its disguise. I haven't seen the not deer again, and I don't particularly want to, but deep down, I know that one day it will appear again. When it does, I do not think it likely that I will escape it for a third time. That is why I have pledged to do whatever I can to try and end this monster, whether it be by bullet or the power of Christ, when that fateful day finally does arrive.
Thank you for joining us on this captivating journey. If you found this exploration as enthralling as we did, please like, share, and subscribe.